Our Bible word is Galatians 5 verse 1. Stand fast therefore in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage. So the epistle to the Galatians. Let's first look at the context of the epistle to the Galatians. Paul is the author, and there are two main ideas by scholars of when Paul wrote this and what the historical circumstances were. The one idea is called the Northern Galatian hypothesis. This says that Paul wrote Galatians in one of his later missionary journeys around the middle of the 50s AD to the northern area of Galatia. But that's not our approach that will be taken here. Far more convincing is something known as the Southern Galatian hypothesis. And this says that Paul wrote this letter to those congregations in the south of Galatia, and the congregations he visited during his first missionary journey. So if you follow the Southern Galatian hypothesis, our timeline will be something as follows. Of course, Paul, he was called to be an apostle by Jesus, and Paul says for 3 years he didn't go up to Jerusalem. And so for the first time Paul went to Jerusalem was in the year 37. And that's where he met Peter and James. We can read more also about this in Galatians 2, where Paul writes about what happened to him and his calling as an apostle. So in the year 37, that was his first visit when he saw Peter and James, that's Jesus' brother, in Jerusalem. And then he went again after that to Jerusalem in 48. And he took along Barnabas and Titus. This was also when Paul took famine relief for the Christians in Jerusalem from the Christians in Antioch. And then also around 48 AD, this is something that's called or referred to as the Antioch incident. That is when Peter was in Antioch and the Jews and Gentiles, they were freely at table fellowship. Then Paul writes in Galatians, some men from James came there and they caused trouble, and because they probably insisted no, Jews and Gentiles cannot eat together. And Peter also withdrew from table fellowship, and Paul was really angry about this. But that was the Antioch incident. So the issue of how to incorporate Gentiles into the faith, that was one of the events where it really came to the surface. And also in 48 AD, this is when Paul went on his first missionary journey. And we can read that in Acts 13 to 14. And he visited those congregations in southern Galatia, that's in Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And it's probably to these congregations that the epistle of the Galatians is aimed at. But after Paul's first missionary journey to these congregations, some Jewish missionaries came there and they said, no, Paul is not telling you the whole truth. You must be circumcised. You must follow the Jewish way of life. In other words, they must become Jewish, and then only then will you become real Christians and incorporate it into the covenant people. And now when Paul heard of this, so in the year 49 AD more or less, that's when he wrote this epistle to the Galatians. And after this, also about 49 AD, then there was the Apostolic Council in Jerusalem to sort out this issue of the Gentiles. And they don't have to be circumcised, etc. And so they can become part of the Christian fellowship together with the Jewish people, the Jewish followers of Jesus. So we'll follow the Southern Galatian hypothesis, and this would make it Paul's earliest epistle that he wrote in the year 49 AD. Also together with 1 Thessalonians, that was another very early epistle of Paul. So Paul went on his first missionary journey, and now he's heard there are these troublemakers that came to these congregations, and they said, Paul's gospel, or what he's telling you, is not the whole truth. You must be circumcised. you must observe the food laws and Sabbaths, etc. And essentially they requested that these Gentile Christians, they must become Jews before they can become Christians. And if we go read in Galatians 4, verses 9 to 10, Paul specifically writes there, especially in verse 10, you observe days and months and seasons and years. So now it's these other missionaries insisted they must observe the Sabbath and all the other Jewish festival dates, etc. And also if we go to Galatians 5, verses 2, Apostle Paul also writes, indeed I, Paul, say to you that if you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. So these opponents were saying Paul's gospel is defective. His whole understanding of Jesus is questionable, etc. And now, but you must do this now. You must become Jewish in order to become real Christians. And of course, Paul defends himself against these other missionaries. If you go right at the beginning of the epistle, he says there, Paul, an apostle, not from men, nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. So Paul is defending his status as apostle. And he's saying, my gospel is not defective. I was chosen as an apostle by Jesus and God the Father. So I'm a genuine apostle. My gospel is true. What I'm telling you, my understanding of the gospel is the correct understanding. So Paul must defend his status as apostle against these, what he calls these troublemakers who've arrived there in his Galatian churches. So what these Christians or these Jewish missionaries probably argued was, you must become part of the Jewish people. For, of course, at this time there would have also been lots of nationalism, if you can call that, in Judea and Israel. Because a lot of things happened there. So the anti-Gentile sentiment would have been strong to become free from these Gentiles and the Romans, etc. And there's this movement of Jews. They are followers of Jesus. And part of them is that they eat with Gentiles. And they worship with Gentiles and eat their food, etc. So there's a blurring of the boundaries. So this would have been ammunition for those Jews who did not believe in Jesus, and saying, you see what those followers of Jesus are doing. They're having table fellowship and eating food with Gentiles. And they are undermining us as a people, our social boundaries as a called people, as a special people. So the Jews or the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, at this time under the leadership of James, Jesus' brother, he became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So they would have felt under pressure that this blurring of the boundaries and incorporating Gentiles so freely caused them trouble. It would have caused them trouble to reach other Jews to become followers of Jesus. So there would have been this kind of backlash and saying, hang on, you cannot just eat with Gentiles, etc. I mean, this is causing trouble for us with our fellow Jews. We want them to bring them to faith in Jesus. And that's why also this Antioch incident happened, where Peter withdrew from table fellowship and says, hang on, you're making it difficult for us. But of course, Paul completely disagreed. I mean, he was what you can call a real maverick apostle. He felt nothing more for these social boundaries. Because these Jewish missionaries, if you look at that image on screen, they would have understood themselves as the traditional covenant people of God. They are the descendants of Abraham as Jews, even though they are followers of Jesus. And part and parcel of this identity as God's people is to do works of the law. And these works of the law would be circumcision. It would be the feast days like the Sabbath and the other pilgrimage festival days, etc. It will be to observe the food laws. And outside of this boundary will be the Gentiles. They're not part of the covenant people. They're not descendants of Abram. So this would have been the traditional understanding of Jews, and even many of the first Jewish Christians, they were still understood themselves that salvation, to belong to God's people, only belonged or was only for those who had Jewish identity. It's for the Jews, no one else. And if you want to form part of the salvation community, you must become part of this Jewish identity. And Paul disagreed. If you look at the image on screen, there's a new social identity. And they are also the covenant people of God. They are the descendants of Abram. But here, the most important boundary marker here is Jesus. Jesus, together with faith and together with love, to do works of love. This is now the real people of God, the followers of Jesus. They live in the Spirit compared to those outside, those who live in the flesh. So Paul casts away these traditional boundaries that circumscribed of those who belong to God's people, the works of the law. And he says, no, that's no longer there. It's irrelevant now. Because Paul also argues in Galatians, the law was temporary. The law was only there for Israel. And it was like living a life of slavery. It was being like an adolescent. It was very restrictive. It was something there to hold you in check. For example, if we go to chapter 3, verses 24, Paul writes there, therefore the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ. Now that word tutor in English, the Greek actually refers to a slave. A slave that accompanied a boy to school and back, also to make sure he doesn't get into trouble. So that's Paul's argument. That's what the law was like. It was like the slave who accompanied us to make sure that we just do what we're supposed to do and not get into trouble. But that is over now. The law was temporary. Now faith has come. Christ has come. People, humanity, so to speak, has come of age. And so that's the main thrust of Paul's argument. Christ brought us liberty. He brought us freedom. We have grown up, so to speak, now. We've been adopted as God's sons. We're no longer like slaves or like adolescent boys who need to be under guardians and stewards to watch over you. It's also a whole different time frame that has happened now, where people have grown up, so to speak, and the life they lead is a different type of responsibility. So now if we come to our textual unit, that is just before this, Paul gives an allegory of two covenants. And he compares the life under the law versus life like following Jesus. And he makes use of Hagar and Sarah. So Hagar, she's the one that stands for slavery. And she's the one that represents Jerusalem and life under the law. And in opposition to Hagar is Sarah, and she represents freedom. And it's a life free from the law. And it's also a freedom to do the right things through love, etc. And so Paul essentially tells the Galatians, come to freedom, or our faith is one of freedom. Christ has redeemed us from the law. We're no longer children. We're no longer restricted. We're no longer like adolescents, because we've received the adoption as God's children. And chapter 5, verses 1 to 12, more broadly speaking, is like a conclusion of Paul's argument that do not abandon your freedom. And more narrowly, verses 1 to 6, is that submission to circumcision is contrary to freedom in Christ. So let's go to 5 verse 1, our Bible word. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage. So Paul is saying here the law is like a yoke. it restricts you. There's no freedom in this. And because sometimes yoke was used in a positive sense, like Jesus refers to the yoke in the gospel, my yoke, in other words, my teaching. But yeah, the yoke language derives more from times of war, when those who were defeated, many of them would be taken as captives, as slaves, and they would have been yoked to be taken to various places, to be sold as slaves on the slave market. So Paul is saying here, it's kind of like that. Now, these Jewish Christians, or Jews maybe generally, they want to be like these people who enslave you. And Paul says, this is not what it's about. This is not about Gentiles submitting to Jewish customs, or about Gentiles submitting to Jewish identity. It's to be under a yoke. It's to be like a slave. And if we go to verses 2, indeed, I, Paul, say to you that if you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. So here's a key issue here. Because these other Jewish missionaries coming there, they would have insisted, if you want to belong to God's people, you must do these works of the law. And because only that's where salvation will be experienced, by having this Jewish identity. And Paul says, no, don't be circumcised, because this is not the gospel. Christ came to abolish this differentiation between Jew and Gentile. Jew and Gentile, they are now one in Christ Jesus. And also, if you do this, your faith in Christ is worthless. Your baptism is worthless. You're saying Christ is not enough. Only faith is necessary. That's all. Faith is the main issue here. You don't need to be circumcised, because now they're saying Christ, what He's done through His death and resurrection, and through us coming to faith in Christ, that's not enough. Now you must also adopt these Jewish customs. And Paul says no. And Paul also says in verse 3, if you want to get circumcised, you are obligated to do the whole law then. Every single thing that's in the law you're obligated to do, because obviously you're adopting the Jewish way of life. You're adopting Jewish identity. And traditionally, they understood themselves, they must do all these things in the law to keep it, the works of the law, etc. But Paul's argument is also that they themselves, they cannot keep it. No Jew can keep the law perfectly. So that way of doing it does not work. Because, of course, all are still sinners, but Christ has come to fix the whole situation. He's the main thing now that makes people righteous. And in verses 4, he compares those who will be circumcised as like a flower that fades away, that dies, and it falls off the stem. Then you have fallen away from Christ. That source that gives you life, this new life in the Spirit, this life that empowers you and enables you to do works of faith. In other words, works of love to your neighbor, etc. And in verse 6, Paul also writes, for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything, but faith working through love. So this is the identity of God's people. They are God's covenant people. Those who belong to Christ, those who live in the Spirit, those who have faith, those who have this faith operating through love. These are the people of God. No longer these other typical Jewish customs and identity markers that created a boundary and a separation between Jew and Gentile. So this was Paul's argument. Retain your freedom. He says also, stand firm like a soldier. Be brave, be strong. Christ has given us freedom. And keep to this freedom. And do not put yourself under this yoke, this bondage, which he says here is the law, which is so restrictive. Christ has brought us freedom. And it's freedom from the law, but also it's freedom to do good things, freedom to love your neighbor. So It's a call to embrace this freedom that Christ has brought us.